that guy has like no imagination, and anything remotely interesting is going to sound like a crazy fantasy to him. Like
Listen,
he's never been able to
this
imagine.
is totally on the record, right? Like
Yes.
I feel bad saying this because I don't like to say mean things about people, even Nazis. Not really, but like
Wrong show.
But so like Nazzaro doesn't have any charisma at all.
Yeah.
Yes.
And like his videos, I watch the videos all the time, and I'm fascinated by the fact that like he's so boring. You know, and his contributions
he was
to like
so hard to imitate.
his insurgency and counterinsurgency, like it's. Did you just like read the field manual, my guy?
Well, that's why we thought he was like some kind of a Fed or something. You know, I mean, like.
Well, I mean, who gets accused of being a Fed and then starts publishing the thank you letters that he's been sent as a contractor for the Feds, and turns around and is like, "How shocking that anyone would make such an allegation!" Like, my guy. Plus, the insurance for your defense contractor firm is still active. You know, like if that did. Whatever, like just be more creative. You're not even entertaining, you know? You're not entertaining.
Yeah, no, he had
really
like the
not.
most dull, like desk jockey, like type of personality out of like any of those like kind of big name, you know, charismatic Nazis out there.
I mean, that's how low the bar is what I'm
exactly.
saying.
So like
you made a joke about a dance-off against Bin Laden as if you're like an equal level terrorist leader, and that is the most interesting thing you've ever fucking said or done.
And there's no way you're as good a dancer as Bin Laden. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bin Laden's fucking corpse at the bottom of the sea is probably more coordinated, you know?
All right, welcome to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and Ray. And today, Amanda Rogers, who I guess we'll call it an interview, but I already kind of feel like it's a hang, to tell you the truth.
a conversation.
Yeah, I wrote up a whole bunch of questions, and I just want to hear more about the cat now, so I don't know how this is going to go. That's what I'll say.
You can do a part 2 because there's tons of like violence and
cat-only
targeting
material.
counterinsurgency shit that I've learned from my kitten. So
Yeah, all right. Okay, we'll do a very special feline counterinsurgency episode at some point. Yeah.
It's useful for us cat owners.
we even have an area, I just have to say, under the blood python tank that we call Tora Bora because he hides and launches his attacks from down there. But
Ooh, Tora Bora's a throwback. I haven't heard that one in a while.
well,
It was like
man.
2002 or Afghanistan or something.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Uh-huh. Yep.
Yeah, when the
But
massive
always
network.
in our heart, right?
Indeed.
Yeah, so we're here with Amanda Rogers, aka on Twitter, the Provost, also Miss Entropy. All these names, all these roles. Hard to describe what you do.
Not actually a provost.
Yeah. No, yes. Yeah. But I mean, how do I I would like recovering academic? Is that a title I could give you?
I get the question, but I refuse to believe that I'm out of academic life forever.
All right. Okay.
I won't give up for a lot of reasons.
All right.
I view everything that I do as an extension of like, basically education, public education. So that's why I got on Twitter in the first place. And also to make jokes because a lot of people in the academy, as you probably well know, don't really have senses of humor.
Not a funny place.
And take themselves too seriously. And obviously I don't take myself very seriously, but I would consider myself an academic, an educator, and activist, and all these different. I care about the world, and any way that I can affect change, that's what I'm going to do. So.
And you've done journalism as well. I mean, you
uh-huh.
also would be a journalist. Yeah. You got a lot of hats there.
Basically, I can't shut up. That's like my thing.
Okay.
So.
Yes. The friend of the show, Kamal, from way back when, once told me the origin of the word parasite. and it was those who sat beside others at the dinner table and ate their food for free, participating only in conversation, like by talking. And I feel like that's kind of we're all parasites here, just like our Nazi friends thought. So, every once in a while,
I have very impolite thoughts
right.
about higher education and the ivory tower that I'm diplomatically refraining from expounding upon.
Well, that's great, because my first question was on some of your past academic work. So let's
have at it.
Let's slide right into there. Yeah. Before we get to before we get to, I should just say on the outset, like, why I'm glad you're here. Your Twitter has some of the most like funny and helpful breakdowns of a lot of the Nazis that we actually don't get a chance to talk about.
That's so kind.
But it really like I always feel like every time we do an episode, I can find something on your feed that
I really
adds something
appreciate
that
it.
I wish we had.
Basically, when I do them, I'm like, I sit down and I just puke it all out, and then I'll, have that second where I'm done tweeting, and I'm like, why the fuck would I'm a crazy person. Like, that's, because I don't do like the nice edit my thought. I use Twitter. This is like, it's a joke, but it's serious too. I use Twitter to blow off steam, obviously, but I use it as a brainstorming and drafting sort of forum for legitimate articles that I write. But also, I don't believe in censoring the humor in it, because you can't do this work for very long if you can't find some kind of catharsis in it.
Totally.
You got to deal with trauma
break
somehow.
You in half. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But also, I feel like, you're going to translate, this applies to a lot of probably what I'll say today about the Academy in general, but, you have to speak to the audience that you're trying to reach in a way that they can understand. And authenticity matters, in my opinion. Again, obscenity sometimes is the only way to accurately describe obscenity. But also, I want the broadest possible audience to understand what I'm saying. And there's no need to overly complicate it to try to sound smart, because there's a bigger fucking objective at play. So I really appreciate hearing that, because a lot of the time I'm like, I have no idea why anyone would follow me, because I sound insane. It's funny to me and it's useful to me, but outside of myself, I don't. Thanks, basically.
I totally understand. I find myself, I've found myself on the show screaming in James Mason voice, which afterwards makes me not feel like a normal human being. So, like, there is that element of, like, once you get in it, it's...
Listen, that's a good James Mason impersonation, by the way. I've heard it.
Thank you.
Horrifying, but good.
Yeah.
I love his fireside chats, by the way. They're like,
oh my god.
Oh god. Yes.
Nice sweater vest, my guy.
Yeah. Yeah, all right. So but let's talk about, I guess, like, where you're coming from intellectually first, before we get into some of the characters that, we both talked about, but you've gone into depth on some people that we're very interested in and only got to really barely approach. So, but I guess I think I would like to start with how sort of your work is all tied together from, like, your background, talking about ISIS, and especially their sort of tactics at creating an image that the West seemed eager enough to eat up, and what you saw with Atomwaffen and after that, and how that sort of as far as I know, that's essentially what took you down, for instance, like the Metzger rabbit hole, the creator rabbit hole.
Partially.
Is that about right?
Like, I'll try to be as concise as possible, because the weird thing about this is that my personal biography, like, threw me into this space. It was kind of predetermined a long time ago, and I've been trying to not go there. But because of growing up in Wichita, Kansas during the abortion wars, and, like, experiencing being targeted for being one of the escorts at Tiller's clinic, who was, extended family, that brought me into contact with the Army of God and a lot of the discourse around Christian identity circles. And so basically, from the personal political aspect of my life, like my entire existence, right? has been very, very anti-racist.
Mhm.
And also, I went through a series of basically foster homes that were not my exact ethnicity, right? And so I just had a weird upbringing in that sense. And so that's always been a part of my political orientation and personal biography. I'm attuned to images and the emotive power of cultural production because I'm an artist myself, and so there's all this that's my personal junk, right? So I go into my academic program, and I wanted to do visual culture and media studies and art history in the Middle East, and I did, but I'm a shit magnet, and I think more importantly, I'm an adaptable shit magnet because I was working on my dissertation and had been, because of people I'm close to, really close to some Libyan dissidents. So in particular, and I was living all throughout the region during the so-called Arab Spring. So that took a turn, and I started working on affective politics, right, and political aesthetics and social movements because I was there,
Okay.
and the smell of tear gas in the morning is like Folgers for me. I don't know. But through that, I ended up meeting a bunch of journalists, and they ended up getting kidnapped, and the whole ISIS thing. Basically, all this is to say, those different experiences from my personal life led me to this watershed moment, like a crisis moment, where I had to make the decision. I'd never wanted to touch the fucking terrorism topic and in relationship to the Middle East, specifically into Islam, because for obvious reasons, right? I mean,
Right.
it's a cottage industry. It's gross. I can think of maybe 4 people that I respect that are not in it out of this weird Orientalist armchair. I want to be in CIA fantasy world. And it just never wanted to go there. But I felt like I had to, because these different aspects of my life, concern about representation, concern about how easy it is to manipulate people through, the media sphere, through visual images, how to play on emotions, how power runs through all of that. All these things coalesce. And really, I felt like after Jimmy and Stephen were killed, it was this moment of if you don't talk about how this impacted you and what you see is important for the general public to understand about it, you're guilty. Basically, you have something to say that's important, and if you don't say it, then you betray everything that you believe you have been dedicated to your whole life. So it was this back and forth between am I a terrible person and a sellout for talking about my friends' deaths in public and in an academic forum? That's disgusting, and plus I hate this whole terrorism shit, right? But on the other hand, you're one of it was a recognition of you're one of the only people that is placed to say what you have to say and is stupid enough, I guess, to say it, to really go there. So that's what took me into working on the ISIS stuff and the propaganda, visual narratives and terrorism stuff in the Middle East and Muslim world, basically. And the anti-racist, anti-Nazi shit has always been a theme throughout my life. Those obviously begin to intertwine for the most casual of observers when the refugee crisis hits, right? And when you're reading ISIS's own propaganda, because they had this messaging that is so upsetting to me because it's they're basically their foundational narrative for their nation state, I guess you would say, their transnational nation state with the capital in Raqqa was as opposed to American racism, right? Everyone here under Islam is equal and we're not racist and you should come here.
Right. I remember that famous video of them all burning their passports.
Oh yeah, I've written a ton about it because there is there's a civic ritual of basically naturalization into Daesh territory, right? But what pissed me off so much is that is taking that message from Islam, the real egalitarian and anti-racist message of that religion is anathema to me and made me so angry, So looking at the way that mobilizing all the shit that the U.S. has not resolved about itself was there are these two things that are just abhorrent to me, right? The history of this country and how it hasn't really been something that the public has reckoned with and dealt with. And then on the other hand, the abuse of that component of Islam made me start being cognizant of the ways in which these groups have a symbiotic relationship, and then from there it was kind of down the spiraling drain of looking at, how they interact. Does that make sense or answer what you were trying to?
Yeah. Could you though also kind of go into a little bit of detail about exactly that relationship? Is it just something that is like how they both play off of large scale media narratives that the state has an investment in? Is that the connection, or is it something more? I don't know what I'd say, like personal or something.
Like honestly, I think that you guys could do like 5 episodes on this particular topic because it's so important. It's very poorly understood, and it's a huge question with an even bigger answer. And so, and I'm sorry if I'm like running on. I'm trying to be really concise about this stuff, but it gets complicated. So like with the symbiotic relationship, okay, so ISIS's whole raison d'être, right? They're like point of existence and what they're trying to accomplish is having territory that they control that's Muslim only, and yeah, in theory, non-Muslims can live there, but like the supremacy of their brand of a Muslim population. So to do that, they're trying to force everybody to pick a side, right? And they call this the eradication of the gray zone. They're very open about it. It's one of the reasons why ISIS is perfectly willing to attack where they know Muslims will die. The purpose is to incite cycles of revenge violence that divide a society. And I've referred to this in other places as basically the globalization of what I call Zarqawi 101. So very tiny flashback to the Iraq War that started in 2003. But Zarqawi, who was like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but it's a lot more complicated than, the general American narratives would have you believe. His approach to how to take over a state is oddly a lot like Steve Bannon's, but I'll go there later.
Okay.
Which is to say that it's divide and conquer on the one hand, right? But it specifically is instigate an attack in which your own side will feel threatened, amp up the threat against your own side, the one that you are claiming to protect, and basically attack the other side so that they begin fighting, and it's this escalating wedge that drives them further apart, and be so extreme in the process that eventually society gets absolutely exhausted and they will cave to the authority of anyone that can bring them stability. That's exactly how the war in Iraq went from an insurgency to a civil war, right? That's Zarqawi's methodology. ISIS has taken that and globalized it for like a Muslim, non-Muslim situation instead of a Shia versus Sunni situation, where basically they want it to come down to a choice between you are either going to leave Islam behind, in which case you're never going to be like white enough or Christian enough for the rest of the world, right? Or you're going to come live with us. It's like death or Daesh is what I say. But a lot of the white supremacists have the same goal. So on the one hand, when I talk about the symbiosis, right, they are both after worlds of separation. And they're both after worlds of separation that they will achieve through instigating divide and conquer wedges that eradicate any semblance of coexistence. And that's why you see so many, I don't want to say false flags because I think that term has been so hijacked, by ridiculous conspiratorial thought, but that kind of strategy, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the base right now and their big plans. The gun rally and all
absolutely.
That. I mean, that's very.
So on the one hand, there's like the symbiosis in terms of like a parallel goal, right? But what people miss about that is that's also a dialectical goal, right? You need the other side to be able to help you drive this wedge. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Then you've got the issue of several of these groups, people going back and forth between whatever extremist organization, like, Devin Arthurs comes to mind, right? He converts to Islam allegedly. And I don't want to use him necessarily because he has so many mental health issues, but he's far from the only example. Like, I know that people in the orbit of a group that I really don't want to name because, like, I don't need shit from them, but I know that you know who I'm talking about. So, like, converting to Islam and then going back and forth between the, white supremacist shit. So you have a lot of operational ties that way. Then you also have, like, the collaboration in terms of, like, groups that are using these discourses but fringe, like Metzger's association with the Nation of Islam back in the day.
Yeah.
And like the new Black Panther Party, more importantly, than the Nation. But so there's a symbiosis, I think, between a lot of those groups that totally continues. And their accelerationism, I think, is really one of the meeting points for a lot of these guys. But they do have operational ties in terms of like people that have gone back and forth, inhabited these different identities. And, you look at Telegram and you have all these fanboy, like jihadi fanboy type channels for white supremacists that use like a ton of Muslim lingo and a lot of Muslim references and like a lot of times the discussion in there is from pseudo jihadis as well. It's very odd space. So I don't want to make a claim I can't substantiate about, the technicalities of operational relations, but I definitely know that they exist. I know that the goals are shared, and I know that both of these sides essentially see what the other is doing as necessary to the achievement of their own objectives, basically.
Right.
Oh, I will also say that, like, pointing that out is what got me targeted by neo-Nazis in the first place. Like, talking about this after Christchurch.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we already mentioned Metzger, so we can talk a little about
Tommy boy.
Yeah, he was all up on your Twitter for a little while there, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Back before he died, Yeah. So how'd you and Metzger get acquainted? And also, I think we want to hear about Metzger and war.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
didn't really get into it.
We didn't. We kind of needed to finish this arc, and Metzger's like a whole universe and war. There's a lot to cover, and there's a lot to say about him that we didn't get to do. So I think that, like,
in all seriousness, I mean, not to like jump in and be like, I have a suggestion for your show, but like, in all seriousness, if you want to do an entire episode devoted to Metzger, I will happily come back and do it, because there's so much about him that is not just influential, but absolutely seminal to the vast majority of what we see today in neo-Nazi transnational circles, that I don't feel like it can fairly be covered in, like the half an hour after all of this rambling and shit that I'm giving you to edit through. So yeah, I'd be happy to if you want. But otherwise I can like get to, bullet points of him for sure. I came to his attention because, frankly, Metzger is like Pierce Morgan. He name searches himself.
Okay.
So, that was it. It wasn't because I was like making an impact. It was because Metzger was very old and very interested in like anyone paying attention to him, because the last sort of like peak that he had in terms of, mainstream attention, or fairly mainstream, is Louis Theroux and the documentary about him.
Right.
And Metzger at many times throughout his career, and I would argue this is absolutely a strategic, program for him. But I'm not going to go into a tangent about it. But he came off as a buffoon and a clown, which was definitely partly his point, right? Because you could write him off and underestimate him, and he thrived on that. Anyway, but so he would basically be on Twitter, looking for attention, because he was a megalomaniac at the same time as he was happy to be underestimated. So I think it was like a super old dude looking for his name on Twitter, used to be relevant, kind of losing it, just like literally he did the Bob Dole referring to himself in the third person, and then like TomMetzgerResist.com. Like that's it. It was really funny to like watch, but also if you clicked on the Resist link at the time, it was in Comic Sans, which I found so hilarious. Awesome. Like only the supremest of the white supreme, right, master fucking race would use Comic Sans.
Well, to be fair, he was like 170 years old, right?
Oh, that's true.
It's the fact that he had Twitter at all is something of a miracle.
Yes. That dude. Yeah, there's tons to say about Metzger. Tons to say about it. So, but yeah, that's how he found
we pretty much just talked about how he founded war, what White Aryan Resistance was in general, and a bit about kind of like I don't know if he was like a proto meme lord in a way. I mean, he made the Nazi Bart Simpson shirt, and good for a soundbite. One of those fellas.
He's so multivalent in terms of strategic approach. God, like seriously, I hope you have another segment that's like specifically on him, because there's so much to say. But about the history of war before war came into existence and how he got there. like how he started?
Vaguely, but I would like give us a little rundown.
Okay. Well, as concisely as possible, because I know not everyone swims in this shitbird's biography, but like me. But basically,
our listeners might.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure some of them have, and I'm sure I've read their obituaries that they wrote for Metzger, and I'm sure I've read their private communications via email with Metzger, but that's a different story that we don't have to talk about.
So you're acquainted.
I'm familiar. But basically, so Metzger goes through the same kind of ideological trajectory. I will not use radicalization because that fucking word is obnoxious and vacuous,
Sure.
for reasons you already know. He goes through the same ideological trajectory as a lot of the American far-right leaders do, which is to say the anti-communism sort of drift through JBS and into like certain presidential campaigns, right? Like Wallace, etc., Goldwater. And then he gets linked up with the KKK, specifically David Dukes out in California. And basically, Metzger had done the same thing after John Birch Society that a lot of these other guys did, where they, that wasn't racist enough, and they wouldn't talk about the real problem, the Jews,
kosher conservatives, and all that bullshit.
That shit. But also, Metzger had a problem with JBS Society because he, like, say what you will about him, and I have plenty of things
Just
to say about him.
Just to clarify, sorry, it's John Birch Society for anybody who's not.
Oh
sure.
yeah, sorry, I thought I said that. But he didn't like being told what to read and what not to read. Like he would read his enemies, quote unquote text, like everything. So John Birch Society was hostile to that, and they weren't open about the Jewish question, in his opinion, and they weren't racist enough. So he kept looking for other options. He joins up with David Duke, and he becomes the California leader of the KKK.
Yeah, right.
And he starts his rebranding at the time. Interestingly enough, like his rise to prominence and what nobody ever talks about is the fact that Metzger was the spokesperson for the first event that led to a military investigation of white supremacists within the armed forces. It was Camp Pendleton out in California. And Metzger made the argument even back then, and this was like 75, I believe, about that time. He made the argument that the KKK cell or group or whatever you're going to call them at Pendleton were just trying to pursue their white civil rights. So already this discourse of like reverse racism, Metzger was the spokesperson for that, for the military, right, at Pendleton. And it's probably a lot of how military, I'm going to shut myself up on this because otherwise I'll rant forever. But that was one of his first big moments. Another one of his first big moments was, and this anticipates so much of what we see now, is super mainstream about illegal immigration and, the politics of like that whole thing. Demographic time bombs, right, of changing the browning of America. Metzger actually organized, people attribute this to Duke, and it's not true. Metzger organized and came up with the idea of this big PR photo op at the border at San Ysidro in Southern California, where he and David Duke basically landed on the top of an INS building with permission of Border Patrol and Immigration Naturalization, and started a vigilante group, the Klan Border Watch Patrol Volunteers, right? And then they got a tour of all the facilities, right? And they, like, as legit open Klan leaders.
Wait, yeah. So using that name, like the Klan.
Well, at certain points, people in INS down in San Ysidro and BBS had said, we welcome assistance from anybody, right? But then they had to walk that back a little bit. Yeah. And I found an affidavit, actually, from 1976 lawsuit about the Klan doing the Border Patrol down here, and in which Metzger straight up says that they have people inside INS and Border Patrol already at that time, right? Damn. In 75. And this is a theme that I saw him repeat throughout his life. Like, even in 2004, 2005, he was publishing in one of his online war newsletters that people within INS and Border Patrol were saying that the organizations were looking for patriots, wink, wink, nod, nod, and that they should apply. Like, our people should apply, and go into this. So on the one hand, people are apt to dismiss the claims that Metzger made, like, way back in the day about infiltration. But on the other hand, when Metzger was nothing if not very pragmatic, right? And one of his big catchphrases was use what works, right? He was not shy about abandoning things when they did not go as planned. So it's very suspect to me to dismiss claims of infiltration that Metzger himself made from the very beginning of his career, right? When you see them repeated all throughout his life, given his pragmatism. The other thing that I wanted to say, that's like what leads him into war. He started because of this period running as a political candidate locally and did not meet with election success. But the interesting thing that people don't normally note is that the acronym for war did not start out as White Aryan Resistance. I can't remember the exact acronym, what it stood for initially, but he wanted a White American Political Action Committee to support political candidates. And eventually he starts taking a hybrid approach to white supremacist activism, where he, on the one hand, pretends to abandon the political realm, but like 2010, when he's back in Warsaw, Indiana, he's running for office again. And he would throw his weight behind political opponents, even as he advocated for revolution as being the primary mechanism for overthrowing the system. So he had a long evolution over the course of his career that I think is very significant and influenced the contemporary transnationalist scene way more than people recognize. But war grew out of at least a public stance of being disaffected with electoral politics as a possibility. And interestingly enough, in very parallel ways, to say a group like, Al-Qaeda, that is to say the vanguard is who you need to get on your side, right? Because the everyday people are not going to be woken up until a crisis point hits. So Metzger started embracing that in the late 70s, early 80s. That's when war comes into existence. And interestingly enough, too, looking at how white supremacist orgs transnationally work today, Metzger was one of the first to really, really step away from membership records and organized groups. He founded WAR specifically not as an organization where you would register your name, right? It was not supposed to be like the Klan he had been a part of, because one of his criticisms of the Klan is you get raided and there are records. They can come after you, right? WAR was oriented to escape legal culpability. However, right, he gets fucked for that during the civil trial of in 89, 90 over the Ethiopian student that skinheads beat to death in Portland. But that said, he deliberately set up WAR to dodge legal culpability for things done in his name and to, basically turn away from the record keeping that was causing legal problems for white supremacist organizations, in the vein of like the American Nazi Party. There's like so much to say about him. I'm sorry. That's
sure. No, that's a
tip of the iceberg
summary.
Oh yeah, there's one more thing I wanted to say that's very significant about the trajectory. Metzger was a communications expert from the jump, and I don't mean from the jump from like his 20s or whatever. He was very precocious about radio technology when he was a child. Yeah. So much to the point that like he started his own ham radio station and network, I think around like 14, 13. And during the war, he was the youngest person, I believe, in the States that was asked to monitor the airwaves for attacks abroad. So then when he enters the military, signals intelligence and communications are what he works on when he's deployed to Germany. So like you have the media and warfare in Metzger's life as being an arc that goes throughout the whole thing. He was really hyper aware of the power and potential of communications, not just technology, but also rhetorical devices, free speech debates, all of these different angles from general realms of media, and he exploited them like nobody else. Richard Spencer never would have gotten to be Richard Spencer had Tom Metzger not pioneered the approach that he did with Geraldo and Oprah and the skinheads in that period.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't think people know that about him though, and it's really critical, I think.
Metzger's and War's relationship with Nicholas Schreck in the 80s. Okay, I mean Nicholas Schreck is a guy who was.
It sounds familiar, but it's not ringing bells really. So like,
he is a person who was the husband of Zena LaWay.
Like the Boyd Rice crew and all the Satanist shit. Yeah. There's a lot of connections. I have a whole separate archive of the interviews that he'd given.
Nice.
I'd also like to say this is very important too, and I wish more people focus on this because it's I think it kind of transects, or whatever the word would be, with like the Boyd Rice kind of like the Satanist contingent, where then you begin to get into like, oh, is Mason Christian identity, or like into esoteric Hitlerism and all that crap, right? It's bullshit to say that like Adam Waffen and the Base and Reed Siege as a meme came out of like 4chan or was recent, because Metzger was the only person in the white supremacist movement that kept Mason's name out there. I have this crazy screenshot of him that I took from one of my archive documents of Metzger on the John McLaughlin talk show on CBS, I think, holding up a copy of Siege, right? And like literally saying read Siege. Back then, I think it was like 92, so there's
crazy.
Also, I can tell you that, God, there's so many crazy things that people haven't discussed in the public realm that are really, really important that link all of these groups together. Like, for example, Iron March actually had Iron March, of all the things that they decided to repost, they posted the text of a lecture James Mason gave at Matthews Hall. Matthews Hall was this like glorified trailer that Metzger had in Southern California, and he would host like phone calls from David Lane from prison and so on and so forth for like the younger members of the scene. But he had James Mason give a talk there in 1985, and in that talk, Mason refers to the fact that he and Metzger have been homies for like over a decade at that point.
Wow.
And people don't talk about that. Over and over again, Metzger would reference James Mason, right? To the point of like the most mainstream, political news show you could imagine, and he's like waving Reed Siege at people. There's that, but there's also things like, when Brandon Russell was trying to form Adam Waffen and looking for, how to contact Mason, the first person he reached out to was Metzger. And like, to prove his credentials at one point, John Cameron Denton, aka Rape, the coolest name ever.
Oh, yes.
Like,
Coolest
what a
guy
great
ever.
nickname. But anyway, so like to burnish his credentials at one point, Rape said that like you can't challenge his place in neo-Nazi circles, basically, because this is a claim, it could be bullshit, but I think it's significant that he had the knowledge base to make this claim, because the claim itself is worthwhile. He claimed to have a copy of Siege at around, he would have been about 12 or 13, that was autographed by Tom Metzger.
Okay.
So like there are tons of these links that, I think should be talked about. And just for the record, like as a very brief encapsulation of like why all this would be like behind the scenes and whatever, and why like Metzger would reach out on Twitter just to be an obnoxious old man. Basically after Metzger lost his court case, the civil case, in 1990, that SPLC brought over the skinheads murdering Berhanu in Portland, Metzger said that it was a victory for him. He didn't see it as a defeat. And we don't have time to get into this, unfortunately, because it's really important for understanding infiltration. But he said he welcomed it because he no longer had any constraints. He had nothing left to lose. And my theory, and I can back it up, but I have to give you like a ton of, evidence for it. Basically, he retreated from the public eye the way that he had, in a different way than he had performed in the past, right? He was much more of a back room sort of dealer after that. And even when he was like a public leader, and I know people that were disciples and acolytes of Metzger's at the time that have left, that have told me what Metzger would do is say to, he'd say to skinheads, like, send me your clean friends, like without a record, right?
Right.
And we will put them in positions of whatever. And he called this Operation Appleseed. But so Metzger was happier to take a back seat after 1990, but continue doing the same shit. Like, he was still publishing things. He wasn't being as much of a, what people would call a media whore, but was absolutely a deliberate strategy, after that point. And it was extraordinarily effective in ways that we see the product now, but don't necessarily have a lot of experts and academics and commentators, being able to trace the trajectory, because bluntly, they all fell for the Metzger as a buffoon.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was never clear to me whether him taking that backseat approach was just because of the legal heat or if it was like a calculated move on his part.
It was calculated. Like you can find him talking about it, you just have to know where.
Right.
And a lot of it, like you have to know the right people that used to be with him, you know. But yeah, it was calculated. Like he would talk about how, you know, and this is true, and it's awkward to say this, right? But yeah, of course he had egos. Like white supremacist leaders and egotistical fuck shit seem to be like kind of thing. I don't know. Thinking that you're superior might have a link to megalomania. I don't know why. What?
Yeah.
Everyone's a Führer.
Basically. But like he did say this, and it is true that he was less concerned about credit than a lot of leaders in the movement. I mean, he was loud as fuck and he would rail on people and whatever, but like he was not as you know, like bloodthirsty in the sense of like an internecine conflict, other than towards David Duke, but that's a different story. But like, you know, he would criticize people, but he wasn't really particularly concerned with like getting the credit per se. And actually, one really telling anecdote about this is in an obituary for him after he died. Someone was discussing in Tom's later years how he became like kind of senile-ish and worried about like the future of the movement. And this person reminded him, like, Tom, this is what you worked for, right? Like you planted the seed, and like you don't know these leaders that you're coming in contact with, but you were the planter, right? Like basically you took this back seat for a reason, you know. And the obituary recounts his position on that. Yeah. So yeah, he was very deliberate. I mean, in the weird thing, not weird, I guess, but frustrating. Tom Metzger was very smart, really, really smart. And people don't recognize it because his politics were bullshit, right? And I mean, in my opinion, but I can't let my just absolute disgust for what he stood for mask the fact that he was a brilliant thinker, and particularly a brilliant thinker in terms of theoretician of like media and warfare.
Right.
You know, it's like
tactician.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just tactician, but like strategist, right? Like all of these things. He was kind of like a Zarqawi figure, except Metzger had charisma and was hilarious and was likable, you know, which is really uncomfortable to say, but you know,
that was his character, absolutely. Like,
totally,
that's how he got on primetime television.
And he could talk to anyone, and he would play off other people in the movement. Like, right, Metzger would show up in a suit and tie with his son, looking all professional,
right.
And then he would bring skinheads that would like get into a brawl.
Exactly.
By comparison, Metzger looks, you know,
Metzger's
I'm just
totally
concerned
rational,
about the everyday man.
Relaxed. Yeah, exactly right.
You know?
Yeah.
So that was another thing that I think is interesting about like his approach to the media that people don't think about, that gives you an indication, I think, a flash forward of a lot of the strategies that are used now by political actors. When Metzger had his talk show, Race and Reason, on public access, he would have his supporters call into the local stations to complain about it. And he would do that so that there could be a controversy sparked over freedom of speech issues, and then it could reach a wider audience, you know. And it was also presented, I mean, it was boring as hell, right? But it was presented to be...
it's a little rough.
Yeah, like presented to be like, you know, suit and tie, sort of just like
it's
intellectual
like a PBS
conversation
thing. Charlie Rose or something.
But like also manufacturing that free speech controversy was central to the dissemination of what he was trying to say. Then another level of significance to it is that, you know, it was like what was I going to say? It was like a meta symbol of legitimacy for a lot of the white supremacist movement, which you guys know, like how their publishing has always worked, right? They have publishing houses. They want to be seen as like credible academics. They want to have their own media institutions.
Yes.
Yeah. But Metzger was very interested in, and he was more capable, I think, than most leaders in the movement with cooperating with other leaders that he didn't necessarily agree with. So he had people on his show all the time that like he didn't fully vibe with in terms of an approach, right? But he wanted a unification of the movement to be more effective, and they could iron out their bullshit later, which is why he was willing to work with like the new Black Panther Party, right? But I think that's super significant, and it's something that people don't notice that Metzger was really one of the big pioneers of before, you know, the Boogaloo Boy Nexus stuff now.
I think Metzger also had kind of more convincing relationship with like the the skinhead movement
Yeah.
and like the white power music scene, then
Yep.
like National Alliance, which was like clearly like kind of despised that
Oh, for
side
sure.
of the movement. He was able to like kind of really masterfully utilize that aspect of the movement while still like doing his own thing and like you said, coming off in the suit and tie and coming off as presentable.
You're totally right, because like what Metzger admired about the skinheads is what Pierce fucking hated, you know,
Right,
even though he dealt with Revolution Records. Metzger was really good at making young racists feel buy into the system and empowering them and not controlling them. You know, like to say that the skinheads were the shock troops of Tom Metzger is only accurate to a point. He basically created systems of incentives for them, but he didn't try to control them. He was a lot smarter than that. You know, like, yeah, I mean, he hosting all of the different shows that he did, and he wasn't contemptuous the way that Pierce was, and like, especially teenagers, they can smell your fucking contempt, right? I mean, which has to be part of the reason why Metzger had a better relationship with the Skins than most of them did. But on that, there was something else I wanted to say about the difference. Metzger was also involved in this way before Pierce was, and for some odd reason, people talk about Pierce like Pierce was the godfather of like ushering in a racist element to the skinhead scene when it reached the U.S., and that's not true. Metzger embraced it more and earlier and welcomed it. He also saw it as this is a key to understanding Metzger, and also will give you flash forwards to like how Heimbach has his appeal or had his appeal. Metzger was always very much like the common man and bringing in the element of economic struggle, right? Like the working man in particular.
Yes, yeah.
And that's where Pierce, honestly, if you want to talk about like strategic stuff, where Pierce fucked up a lot by being such an elitist openly, you know?
Yeah.
I don't doubt that Tom was an elitist to a point, but definitely not in public.
Well, National Alliance also had a lot of problems because of this too. They refused to support like Hammer Skins that were arrested and shit, and they lost a lot of cred.
But I will say that the one thing that nobody talks about Tom is Tom, when Skins would get arrested, if they wouldn't let Tom like come to their sentencing so he could grandstand, he would yank official war support from them and not let them be listed as POWs and like basically leave them on their own on the inside.
Damn.
But it never like kind of became, you know, news. But yeah, it was a thing.
All right. Well, as a segue to another question here, one thing that I guess National Alliance probably did end up taking though from Tom there was I know I saw some FBI document when I was doing the William Pierce stuff that in the 90s National Alliance committed very openly to something very much like Operation Appleseed, and it was thought that they had been doing it for a number of years at that point as well. So maybe we could switch that over now to that topic. Operation Appleseed, sure, but also more like how does this play out today? I mean, what happened to the Utah State Guard? Who gave weapons to the Atomwaffen guys? I mean, this is a long thing.
Oh man, well, but, I honestly, my throat is really hurting, so I'm not sure how long I'll be able to keep talking today. But I'm pissed because all of these are really good questions, and I want to get to all of them. So please, like, do a Tom Metzger specific show. So long story short, about if you're asking about the Utah State Guard, I assume you're asking about the 1980 State Guard that had to be dissolved by the governor because it turned out that 400 members of Aryan nations had taken it over.
Yeah, that's an interesting little bit of news for me when I read that.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that for like until 2 years ago. You know, when I was doing this.
First of all, 400 members of Aryan nations is a lot.
Pretty substantial.
Like a lot of Aryan nations. Yeah, I mean
that's like most of them, right?
Yeah, that's basically Aryan nation.
Or so we would think, you know. But like also Utah is like real crackertastic from what I understand. But like so my theory on this, you can trace the origins, in my opinion, and I don't want to even just say my opinion so much because that's downplaying what is a significant amount of information that substantiates this theory, is that Metzger's program of infiltration was something that he really started working on in about 75. I mean, he was taking credit for it in 1975, right? But when you get to like, it's obvious that it was still occurring all throughout the 70s and 80s. From accounts of people that were close to Metzger that left, from a lot of the things that he wrote, from people getting busted as being affiliated, but also the big significant thing about the Bejarano trial is Metzger gives this speech on the steps of the courthouse after the verdict against him. And he talks about how he's like, oh, you think you're going to stop it? Like, you think this is a victory for you? Really? He's like, when are you going to understand it's too late? The seeds have been planted. What do you think happened to the skinhead, right? They're in your schools. They're in your, they're your political leaders. They're your police officers. They're in your military. Like, it's too late,
Mm-hmm.
And this was him and again, people will say this was bluster, but I don't think so because of the consistency, that you'll find these claims and then these substantiated claims through different cases throughout his life up until then. And so by 1990, Metzger has nothing left to lose anymore, right? Because of that lawsuit. So he straight out says it in public that this is what's been going on and has been going on. And I know that like people credit Pierce for that, but to be honest with you, I've seen so much more evidence from Metzger than ever I've seen from Pierce. I mean, what you can say, I think, is that it becomes difficult to determine like where is a program of infiltration into the U.S. military of white supremacists begin? Like, where's that start point versus the United States military is an overwhelmingly racist institution from early on, right?
Yeah.
Like when
a white supremacist organization in its nature.
But that said, there is a substantive change, like a historical break, once the cost of being an open racist are ratcheted up by the civil rights struggle, right? When there's a cost that will end your career, if people know, you do have to like look at the difference in how the military functioned at that point. Like, I get in fights with people that are like super leftist purists because they're like, why would you even talk about infiltration? The whole thing is like racist. Well, if that's your approach, you miss how the white supremacist like movement had to shift tactics after civil rights, right, and become more clandestine. And if you really want to get rid of this phenomenon, you have to understand how it works. So, I can't pretend that there wasn't a distinct shift at a historical juncture that necessitated new tactics. But I just haven't seen that much comparatively of Pierce's success records. Definitely not like that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think it was a tactic adopted very late in the National Alliance as well, from what I saw anyway. But who the fuck knows? Maybe you could, if you're comfortable doing it now, just to finish off that military topic, maybe get into the National Socialist Order a bit. So how does the successor to Adam Waffen sort of pick up this apple seed?
Well, I mean, it's it's a rebranding, right? NSO is just like AWD by another name. I think we need a lot more time to like get into this. I know that I don't know. Did you guys see Brandon Russell's short-lived Twitter account recently?
No.
It was hilarious. Like him drinking beer in like ostensibly the Caribbean in like an animal liberation movement shirt.
What? Okay. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I have a copy of it. It's real interesting. It lasted for like a day and a half,
Oh God.
And the public face, right? And it's bullshit because like they've had Mason say this for them before, is that like they've renounced violence, they're not violent. Blah blah blah. Maybe they're gonna settle territory and have their like little utopian like cracker Portlandia. But but in any case, that's what they were saying before too, And we know that I think they're regrouping, I mean, they'd be stupid not to. But I don't believe for a second that all of a sudden they're fucking kumbaya and they're just gonna like have their little trad wives and be dairy farmers and, like pump out little blonde babies. Like, fucking come on.
Yeah, the white yeomanry, as much as they love it, is never something that they were particularly good at.
I'd love to see like, I don't know, like which one of I'd love to see them like, churning butter.
Yeah, just John Cameron Denton doing any farm work at all fills me with joy.
Yeah,
I think that would be hilarious. Yes. But what about specifically NSO and the military here? They've carried forward this torch, as I understand it, right? I think you've written something
Well, I
also
mean,
about...
Atomwaffen and the base, like from the jump, have prioritized like military affiliations for recruitment from the beginning.
Right.
They've always had like a disproportionately high number of military active and veteran people involved for the training, but also to get a hold of things like weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the dude's name? The recruiter out in Southern California that was busted. I want to say it was like Turkington or Turkleton, or it reminded me of some like Saved by the Bell last name. David
Tarkington.
Yes,
maybe.
thank
Does
you.
that sound right?
Yeah.
Something like this.
So
hard to forget a name like that.
That's I would not be shocked if NSO was keeping up the same emphasis. Why wouldn't they? On the forums like Iron March and Fascist Forge, they're very explicit about like seeking out military training and education, and like this is where, and I'm not going to get into it, but like the Craig Lane connection to certain battalions operating in Ukraine comes into play, right? Because there's a transnational element to these organizational military networks too. So it's not just like implant people in the U.S. military, although there's an aspect to that. It's also travel elsewhere, and in a way, in my opinion, that this is what scares me about one of the things that scares me about the situation in Russia and Ukraine right now. Like, it's set up for it could become like the Afghanistan for neo-Nazis, of the 90s, basically. And I mean, it's not because of this conflict now, and it's not to say that Ukraine is full of Nazis. It's just the way that networks have formed in that area, and people have been moving in and out for quite some time that are transnationally connected, and how war operates in my experience, right? From letting people have access to training and weapons, But so yeah, I think it's harder to have a sense of where NSO is at right now in terms of who is who and where they're training, and beyond the rebranding. But yeah, I mean, they have all of these things in place, and they have had them in place since the beginning. So I don't suspect that all of a sudden they're going to be fucking infiltrating Greenpeace.
Right.
Although Brandon's Twitter was real convincing.
Yeah, right. Maybe him.
Yeah, if you had the Animal Liberation Front shirt, maybe he's going in that direction now. Which, isn't surprising, I guess.
You should come try to liberate my cat. That would be entertaining.
So maybe, like, I guess we're, like, maybe going to come towards some sort of end here, and I don't know if this is, like, too big of a question to ask, but I was curious about, since, like, we've talked about all these groups, and it's largely, like, a male-oriented phenomenon. I was kind of curious if you knew something about women in the like modern U.S. white power movement, and specifically, like, I know that like there have been some like exceptions to the rule, like Katya Lane played like a pretty big part in like the 90s in that like skinhead scene and whatever, and that like World Church of the Creator also like tried to do a women's thing.
Yeah, like they've all had women's auxiliaries, like the KKK had the women's auxiliary.
Right.
Yeah. I know there have been some studies about like the Klan, specifically women in the Klan. But like, do you know much about that? Like, how much of that was like actually, what were the politics around that beyond just like trad wife? If that's
beyond what? Sorry, trad wife?
Beyond like trad wife or something like that, which it seems like some of that boils down to.
Well, I mean, I think that's like, sadly, I think that's a huge question that's worth pursuing, like, beyond the time that we have, because it depends on which organization. Like, even now, Atomwaffen and the base have like those circles, and other organizations that I won't name have a lot of very prominent female members, both active and former, right? But like, they don't, they're not as visible for reasons. I think part of that is the strategic imperative of like, a woman can keep cover better, because we think of these things as predominantly male movements. We also think of like, women are supposed to be the gentler sex, right? Which is
right.
People are people, in my humble opinion. But like, look at the relationships and the order between not just Catch Elaine, but like Jean Craig, I believe her name was, and Zilla Craig. There were women in as seminal a group like the Order playing key roles, right? But they weren't key roles in the sense that people think of them as, with a weapon on the front line. And I think one of the biggest problems in looking at political violence and the issue of gender is people tend to assume that a kinetic operation is the red meat of how these ideological movements achieve success, right? Just because someone is shooting someone does not necessarily mean the role of that sniper is in the long run the most dangerous role, if that makes sense.
Right. Sure.
And I say this when I think about like a lot of the women that are in these movements that operate behind the scenes that are absolutely seminal in terms of raising kids with the ideological backing, sending them out, maintaining it in the home, encouraging it, but also running things that we don't see day to day, and coordinating operations. Women are a big part of a lot of these organizations. They're just not in the same public roles as like an active fighter, with the weapon that we automatically assume a man is. I think that the discourse of a woman's role, like you can't neglect how prominent women are when you look at the discourse of protecting them, right? And women bearing like white children and protecting the line.
It's just an obsession. Yes,
absolutely. But the thing is, it's not just like the propaganda, PR narrative and rhetoric that of a role of a woman. I mean, you have to have that in the movement as well. You know what I mean? So the propaganda aspect to that is enormous, but the reality of that is also very critical that I don't think people normally think about. And after Estes Park in '92, when there was the pivot away from like the kind of organizing that got people in trouble like post Waco, post Ruby Ridge, when Pete Peters, the CIA pastor, had that Rocky Mountain Rendezvous summit, basically, there was a pivot towards like basically not dumbing down the ideological stances, but cloaking them and doing a more atomized sort of nuclear family assimilationist / infiltration approach to white supremacist stuff. So like the seemingly innocuous couple with the wife that was in like the Rotary Club and shit was one way that they branched out and a new strategy that they took.
I know that like World Church of the Creator like brought up some of like the women in the Klan like back in like the 60s and 70s that like did stuff and then like held them up as like this specific example for like women to follow. But it's not like it was never clear to me whether like how much of that actually really existed in those movements, like whether those chapters did anything. Like War also, I guess, tried to embrace some of this, well, more leftist ideas.
Yeah,
but whether that like filtered down into like gender politics, I'm not quite sure about.
Well, I don't want to like derail this, right? But it's interesting to me because War said that like women could join on an equal footing with men and whatever,
right.
Like, but vague. The language is really vague. But one of the biggest things that pisses me off about analysis of political violence and ideological movements, specifically like jihadis versus Nazis, right, as if they're like a one-to-one comparison, are all the unexamined assumptions that people walk in with. And I'm not suggesting that you are, but what I'm saying in relation to gender, right, is that basically people have a very hard time understanding the reasons that like a 15-year-old girl from London might join ISIS and not fight for them unless a man made her, you know?
Right.
Because there's an assumption of like how a Muslim man operates and how patriarchy works with quote unquote them. It doesn't apply to the way that people generally think about white supremacy, right? That like, sure, a woman might join because of her husband, but like she could get involved on her own. Like there's not as strong of a cognitive dissonance, I think. But what I think is really worthwhile about sitting and thinking about the discourse of feminism, right, is when you look at a group like ISIS and their propaganda, the propaganda, especially that women have written, a lot of it is explicitly in terms of feminism, right? Like female empowerment, albeit configured differently. And you
Right.
have the same thing in white supremacist groups.
Sure.
Yeah,
Um,
the natural role will be fulfilling. It's
well, not just
true.
the natural role, but like that you need to shame the men into actually taking action, because
Uh-huh.
if they won't do it, you will, and they're being bitches. You know,
right,
you
right.
have that operating
Yeah.
with both of them at all times.
Yeah.
Also the role of like marriages in terms of cementing alliances within the movement, and also in, you know, other political violence movements. You know, there's that aspect, I think.
Wait, do you mean they do like internobility marriages?
Yeah, well, at times, yeah, like that. Because, like, listen, who wants to? I'm sure you know what. Like, plenty of fish in the sea. I don't kink shame and shit, but like, who's gonna want to fuck Matt Heimbach? Honestly, your options are limited. Your
Yeah,
master
yeah.
race gene pool is slim at best.
Yeah.
You know,
Uh-huh.
but like there are ties that people strengthen by means of that kind of thing, right? Like, I
Sure.
believe it was David Lane's sister that got involved in the movement and supported him that way. I could be wrong, but basically, like, these nodal networks that develop, you have that happen a lot. Like, you have that happen in other political violent groups. I think it's really difficult to. I mean, I'm sure someone could give you an answer. I can tell you that I know for a fact that I'm nowhere near smart enough to say that yes, like there's X amount of truth to the you know, role of like women doing X, Y, and Z. I don't know. I have no fucking idea. You know, because it's trying to qualify the ineffable, and I personally don't think anyone is capable of doing that with any degree of certainty. But you know, from the accounts of women, I think, you know, much more important roles than we typically recognize, largely because of the way that we conceive of what an important role is.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah, because we traditionally look at it as like whether it's like something like the Order, the dudes that are on the front lines, robbing banks and shit like that.
But like the counterfeiters, like one of the counterfeiters for the Order was a woman.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
like what's I get really, there's the day coming too, and it's wild because it's like ISIS says this and Al Qaeda says this. Like the day is coming where women will absolutely be allowed and or like pushed to physically fight as well, you know?
Right.
But I just think that there's an assumption about that doesn't really make sense when you think about it in terms of like political violence we assume to be ideologically motivated. Why is the physical act of violence the most dangerous thing? You know, like we give a hierarchy to the men in the organizations when we think that way, I think. And there are women in all of these, like, who was like Cardo's wife, Willis Cardo's wife. Like, there are a lot of teams basically in the history of fascist and white supremacist movements, you know, transnationally, that like they're absolutely indispensable. You know, even if neither of them is a fighter, but for some reason there's an erasure of the female component to that, and I think that's dangerous because it means that we are apt to let women off, you know, when a lot of times definitely shouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there are a lot of active players.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about Yaki's sister just now. All right. Well, you know, to prevent whatever's eating you alive over there from finishing you off, we should probably close this
I am
up.
so sorry. Like, my sore throat has been going for days, but like, please, like, do another episode specifically on Metzger. I'll have to come back.
We want to we need to leave the American Nazis aside for a little while.
Oh, yeah.
You know, mental and spiritual health. I mean, damn.
I was very excited to talk to you about Metzger because, like, I know you know so much about him, and it is such a big topic to cover. I mean, all of these guys that we talked about, you know, you can go on forever and ever about them, but Metzger specifically is a pretty interesting character in this whole shit show of freaks.
Are you guys doing any like Sweden based shit anytime soon?
Ooh, Sweden. I think it's gonna be a while before we get to West Europe.
I was just gonna be like, FYI, you know, the links between like Metzger's links transnationally, also totally not known, but like hugely influential in basically building what became the Swedish Democrats. Has a lot to do with Metzger.
They have my favorite fascist logo out of all of them. The pretty flower is just the most brilliant. Like,
There's so many choices.
Yes.
But yeah, there's tons of.
It's like a Lisa Frank flower. You know what I mean? It's like it should be on like an elementary school.
Okay,
pencil bag.
listen, don't say fucking Lisa Frank to me because I'm so like my notebook collection specifically for writing my thoughts and notes about neo-Nazis.
Oh, damn.
I have a collection.
You were not kidding.
It's the joy that it gives me thinking of how uncomfortable it would make them. So yeah, I collect them specifically for that purpose. But it was a blast to talk to you guys. I love your work.
Yeah,
Thank
you
so
too,
much
you
for
too.
having me. And yeah, I've like if ever you want to talk about this stuff again, or even like hit me up with a question, because like, you know, I'm all I do now without the job is do this shit like to anyone that will listen, because I still, you know, it still matters. Absolutely. So thank you for giving me the chance.
No, I mean, we'd be happy to have you on again, especially to talk about Metzger. Definitely got some more questions there.
Anytime.
And for all of the listeners, take a look at Patreon. It's Misanthropy, right? We got to give you the plug here, right?
I believe. Thank you. That's very kind.
Subscribe. She got a lot of cool stuff there.
Once again, got to close this for your end with like, you guys do definitely some of the best work out there. And I'm very grateful to you for it. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Keep it up.
You're talking about the RPG episodes, right? Just to be clear.
Everything. From James Mason imitations and beyond.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Anytime.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.